You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Han Solo. That's right. We would never pick a fight with a Wookiee. So I have a few guests coming down the pipe for Mondays, including our regular co-hosts and some special features in the next month or so. And on Thursdays, Talking Headways, we'll be joined by landscape architecture professor at the University of Illinois, Mary Pat McGuire, to talk about depaving cities. So we hope you enjoy that one as well. But for now, it's just going to be us. And we appreciate you all for listening, and I hope this episode will be a fun one too. So this is episode 97. We are in session. And as usual, before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both Mondays at the Overhead Wire and Talking Headways on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. And thanks to folks who subscribe through podcatchers. We really appreciate that. It's awesome you keep coming back to the show. And like I said, we really do appreciate it. So let's get to the news. We have some short news items this week, a couple of things to talk about. And as we're talking now, it's a Monday. It is Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We record on Mondays, and I try to get this out as soon as possible, unlike the regular Talking Headways podcast, which I usually do a couple weeks in advance of releasing. But right now, in terms of the infrastructure bill, the reconciliation bill, there's a bunch of fights about what's going to happen. They're saying that things are going to get voted on Thursday for the infrastructure bill. And obviously, centrists are trying to get the progressives to cave and only vote for the infrastructure bill because they don't want anything in the reconciliation bill. We'll see what happens. But as of this time, I have no tea to spill on that specific topic. I'm sure we'll have some news in the next few days, whether it's good or bad. I personally, I don't know. I'm if I see the infrastructure bill go down, I honestly, at this point, I'm really wouldn't be that sad about it because it seems like a crap bill to me. Lots of roads and highways and stuff, and all the other stuff that people are saying are progressive in there. That's things that can be passed in the future. I don't think, the idea of the other infrastructure stuff is something that can't be passed in the future. I mean, it's already things people have agreed that are important, so, whatever. But again, that's how I'm feeling about it. Maybe a little bit down on it just because of the process and the politics and the horse racing crap and all that stuff. If you want a great kind of overview of what's in it, check out our newsletter for one, but also, and actually you can get the newsletter by signing up at theoverheadwire.com. But also go to Yona Freemark's Twitter account, YFreemark, because he has a really cool chart that is basically all of the stuff that's in the infrastructure bill. If you want to learn about it, see what's in there, because I'm tired of the horse race stuff. It's just kind of bullshit. It's like fighting over stupid stuff, and the politics of it all is really annoying. Just because, corporate people, that type of thing. Anyways, so let's get to the news. Here are a few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks. Here are a few items of news before we get to our discussion. So not much discussion today, obviously, because it's just me and you. But the first item is about standards set by the World Health Organization for air pollution. So one of the things I've become acutely aware of over the last few years here in the Bay Area is air quality. And I think a lot of people who live here have too, and maybe even across the country this year, because a lot of the fires have spread particulates across the United States, even going as far as New York. But during the summer fire season, you're never quite sure if you're going to get a clear day. And if you do, it's likely the winds will be moving particulates at someone else's expense. So maybe it'll move stuff away from San Francisco, but then it'll move it into the Central Valley and Bakersfield and those places, or it'll move it north, or it'll move it a different direction. So the wind will take it wherever it's going to take it, and somebody else is going to get it whether you do or not. But understanding more about how the particulates and emissions create these respiratory health problems is driving these advisory guidelines on what healthy air quality looks like. So as such, the World Health Organization, WHO, after 5 years of research and 500 peer-reviewed studies, has slashed its guidelines for nitrogen dioxide produced by diesel engines by 75%. For particulate matter, or PM2.5, the number has gone from 10 to 5 micrograms per cubic meter. And so for those who are familiar with the air quality index score, when you wake up in the morning, a lot of people here in the Bay Area will check the air quality index score. You know that green is healthy, yellow is getting a little bit unhealthy, orange is super unhealthy, red, purple, it gets to be really bad. Well, so the 5 micrograms per cubic meter, just to put that in perspective, a 100 air quality index score, which is 100, which is unhealthy orange, is 35 micrograms per cubic meter. So 7 times above the new guidelines that are being set by WHO, which means there's a lot of work to do as practitioners to reduce these numbers. It's not just from engines, it's also from tires, it's particulates generally. But ultimately, we could save a ton of people's lives. I mean, if we, putting down to those numbers, WHO says, they say that we can reduce deaths around the world by 80% if we get down to those air quality numbers. That's a huge amount of people. I mean, millions and millions of people die every year from air quality effects, whether that's induced heart attacks and things like that. So this is not just, this is from peer-reviewed studies. This is from information that they've learned over the last 5 years from research from a number of different places around the world. And so I think that's really important to think about when we're thinking about air quality. I mean, getting down to 5 micrograms, that's really a big reduction in air quality. And what we're going to need to do is a lot less, obviously there's going to need to be a lot less fires, but a lot less, particulates from driving, a lot less particulates from diesel engines, whether it's from trucks and other things. Those things are really, really harmful to our lungs and to our respiratory health. So an interesting piece from the World Health Organization. So next up, last week we posted an article from the French publication Croix Translated through Google Translate in the newsletter. It's a basic overview, but an interesting look at some of the changes that 40 years of high-speed rail have brought to France. It kind of got stuck behind a paywall a few days after we posted it. So there's another one actually from Ars Technica out today. And as always, we'll post some of these pieces, actually all the pieces, in links in the show notes so that you all can click on them if you want to take a look at what the article says and make sure that we're we're conveying the right information. Obviously, sometimes it's a little bit of an opinion, but most of the time we're trying to get across what the article says and what the facts are. But ultimately, 40 years ago, basically, France, 40 years ago, actually maybe today or yesterday, it's the 27th of September, approximately 40 years ago this week, the TGV started in France. And, what it did was it really kind of reduced travel distances, or at times, actually, I should say, the distances are the same, but it reduced travel times between cities, and it actually made everything shorter. I mean, in terms of time, one of the most interesting things I've heard a number of times is the idea that people think of distances between cities now in France in terms of the time it takes to get there rather than the distance in kilometers, which I think is really fascinating. Ultimately, the TGV and subsequently the AVE, the ICE, Eurostar, et cetera, all shrunk Europe as the train was designed with affordability in mind. So everyone, not just the rich, could ride it. So that's a really interesting point about high-speed rail in those countries is that, it's not just for people who are jet setting, not people getting on the Concorde and going across the Atlantic in 2 hours or whatever it was at the time. I'm sure that I'm getting that wrong, but it's actually for people of all stripes that could get to where they're going. So I think that was a really important point of it. And, here in California, we're working on high-speed rail. Texas is working on high-speed rail. You got the Northeast Corridor that's future. They're going to spend some money if that infrastructure bill passes or not, whatever is going to happen. But I get a lot of grief from non-transportation planning friends about California HSR, and some of it's well-placed. We're going kind of slow, but I really think this would be missing a big opportunity if we let this opportunity lapse to put high-speed rail into practice in California. Look, it's 40 years ago that France started. You got to start somewhere to get a network to go and get people to the places where they want to go. And now, because we've had 40 years of high-speed rail in France, they actually have laws now in place where they can reduce the amount of air travel, which causes a lot of emissions as well. So, there's certain trips, certain city pairs where you can't fly anymore unless it's a connecting flight to go to an overseas trip. if there's if there's a high-speed rail trip that could be made in its stead. So they've made significant strides in reducing emissions that way. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few years as that gets implemented. But also, from an information standpoint, I think make sure to check out some of the episodes we've done previously about high-speed rail, especially the ones on German and French high-speed rail. I think it's super fascinating. We had Eric Eidlin on, who, if you haven't listened to those, he's a German Marshall Fund Fellow at the time, studying both German and French high-speed rail, and has lots of interesting things to say about them from his research. He also had an episode where he hosted it, which was on Talking Headways, with some French planners talking about station area planning as well. And that was really interesting too. So check out episodes 67, 129, and 130 if you want to hear more about that specific topic, because we're not going to go into it as deep today. But I think that 40 years is a good marker of what you can do when you're thinking about high-speed rail. So congrats to the French. Hopefully they can continue to expand their network and throughout Europe. Okay. Ooh, I'm sorry if I'm talking fast. I get so excited. Berlin purchases private housing. So Berlin has purchased more than 15,000 apartments from 2 private companies to increase its housing stock ownership to a fifth of the total rental units in the city. A federal court ruled in April that a rent cap was unconstitutional, so the city is seeking other ways to encourage affordability. When Berliners headed to the polls Monday to vote for new local and national governments, a non-binding referendum also gave guidance on whether the city should expropriate more property from landlords. So I wrote this piece last week, and actually they had the election on Monday, and Berlin passed the advisory vote by 56.4%, which means over 1 million people voted to expropriate some property from landlords, from the corporate landlords, the big ones. And campaigners that were supporting that measure now say that this vote should give Berlin the kind of a guide on how to put 240,000 flats back into public ownership. And it's amazing how much housing is a flashpoint at this moment in time around the world. I think Vienna's examples of public housing for residents, a lot of people will see that and then kind of maybe move forward to Berlin to see how this all pans out from an international perspective. I'm sure there's other examples around the world that we should be looking at as well that I didn't obviously think of before talking about this. But this is an interesting result. It's interesting that they voted, even if it was non-binding, to think about better ways to get housing back into the public ownership. Really interesting thinking about housing as a public good. So not much else to say on that one. Interesting results. Next up, revisiting redlining's history. Researchers digging into the history of housing discrimination have found that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC maps, often associated with redlining, were likely not the guidelines on which the Federal Housing Administration and other private lenders based their racist lending practices. They came up with those all on their own. In looking at 16,000 loans in 3 cities, researchers found that HOLC actually refinanced loans for black homeowners more than other entities in the short time it existed, indicating the agency may have a worse reputation on race than it perhaps deserves. This was by Jake Blumgart in Governing. Jake's been doing a great job lately. Love his articles in Governing. He does a lot of transportation and housing stuff. But there's been a lot of work on this subject. But the researchers ultimately found that the maps we most associate with redlining, which are those HOLC maps, weren't actually used by the FHA to do the actual redlining that the FHA did. The researchers were worried actually initially that their findings would be construed as the fact that there was no redlining, but that wasn't their intent at all or the case, because there was tons of redlining. There was tons of discrimination. It just might not have happened the way we thought it did. Additionally, those maps didn't lose value for the lessons they teach, in my opinion. Ultimately, if you overlay any number of social or physical issues and data onto the map, you see the outlines of many of those HOLC maps that show through. We've seen this in a number of places where people have taken the maps, put them into GIS, and kind of given you an estimation of where discrimination was still happening, where there's like a digital redlining that we talked about even on the show about a year ago, through the Zillows and other maps, that it's not it's not visible necessarily, but it's still kind of embedded in the practices overall. And it's hard to get away from that if it's been embedded for so many years. It's the same thing that people are trying to wrestle with artificial intelligence. If you teach a machine to be a certain way and you're a certain way, then it's hard to unteach that practice specifically. So these are some interesting things that come out of those maps. Not to say that they were used by the FHA, but they still tell a story, and I think that's still important. And many times our histories aren't quite as cut and dry as one or two books lay them out to be. The truth is always much messier, and the truth is probably always, in that part, kind of an idea of how things actually happened. So along those same lines, as history is often written by the victors until researchers can patch together more information from those who didn't win or were impacted unfairly, I wonder how much we miss as we can't talk to everyone that actually existed at that time. Think about your personal lifetime of experience, for example. Think about Robert Caro's massive series on LBJ, and that's not even everything in his life. Even though Caro has an extensive information available from the LBJ library, from letters, from pens that were written, from like secondhand accounts, people that were actually part of the Senate at the time when he was doing his research. I mean, think about that. It's like I think it's like 6 books now that are like 400 pages each or something ridiculous. I mean, think about the Power Broker times like 5, and you get this LBJ series, but that can't even come close to encompassing what this person's life was. And so, understanding that we can't take the people that were around at the time experiencing this stuff, and we can't get their experiences anymore because many of them are gone. That makes me kind of bummed out, but also I don't think we could process that much information. Everything's a highlight. So there's just no way to know if all the details were told correctly, specifically along those lines. That isn't to say that we shouldn't learn from history. Obviously we should. It just should make us a little bit more cautious and open to learning more about what's going on. And think about the history of things that have gone past. So I thought this piece was really interesting. I always think it's interesting to think about, what we've done wrong in the past and how we can fix it. I think this is a good way to think. The maps are obviously still informational, I think, but they might not have been used in the way that we thought they were. So interesting findings there from the researchers. Okay, this is the last piece for today. A little bit shorter, but I think this is a really interesting piece as well. As I kind of adjust my chair, maybe I should drink some water too. You guys are listening to everything. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to edit this because it's just too much fun. Okay, this is a 3-parter. There are 3 items I thought could go into a larger discussion, so I'm going to read all 3 pieces from items that we put out through the newsletter, but I wanted to kind of connect the dots here. So the first up, electric vehicle chargers are not in the zoning code. So as electric vehicles become more popular, residents without indoor parking spaces will be looking to install chargers. But at the moment, most zoning codes don't have regulations related to them. Milwaukee, Wisconsin is looking to change its zoning code to allow a charger next to any legal parking space as long as it doesn't block pedestrian access, while also creating provisions for public charging stations. So this is by Jeremy Janine at Urban Milwaukee, one of our favorites. Interesting piece about changing zoning codes to allow electric chargers on streets. Second, do we really need 500,000 EV chargers? Electric car proponents are arguing that we need 500,000 chargers to entice people to purchase electric cars and get over range anxiety. But Aaron Gordon argues that thinking is for a world that supposes we refuel vehicles as we had before. This, however, is not the case for most electric car owners who charge their cars at home rather than at a fueling station. Those who live in homes that have garages, for example. 64%, I think it was the number. I didn't write it down, but that's off the top of my head. There should be targeted investments for longer trips, but the 500,000 goal might be a waste of money. And that was by Aaron Gordon, another one of our favorites to talk about on the show, from Motherboard, Vice. And then finally, the gas station business model. In 2020, gas stations in the United States sold enough fuel to fill up 187,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools, But despite demand, more often than not, gasoline is a loss leader for independent owners who make just a 1.4% margin on fuel. To put that into perspective, grocery stores make a 2.5% margin, and other industries in general make just under 8%. Station owners make up for minimal gas revenue with markups on convenience items such as candy and 100% on soft drinks. That was by Zachary Crockett at The Hustle. So all these things, all these items come together. Aaron Gordon's interesting piece in Motherboard about the decision to invest in 500,000 car chargers potentially. Most people charge their cars at home, and I think I gave that 60-something% number out, and will power them more like their cell phones, he says. So planning for so many public chargers outside of major highways and rural routes might be a waste of resources. This is really interesting to think about because as we think about how we are energizing our vehicles, thinking about them more like cell phones where we bring them home at night and then we plug them in, maybe if we're smart. If we weren't smart, we'd just let them go and then had to bring our charger or forgot our charger, wherever we were going. But that's kind of the thing, right? Is if you are charging your car at home, you don't need to go to a gas station or an electric station to fill it up. It seems kind of like an inertia issue, right? We keep thinking that the way we used and powered cars in the past will be the same as we do in the future. However, existing practice shows that might not be the case. Most people, outside of cities have garages or carports. So people that live in major cities that don't have other options will need on-street chargers. And that's where the zoning part comes in, right? Thinking about where you can put chargers. But it also made me think that in the past that public utilities and transit agencies have a revenue opportunity for active transportation funding in cities through charging at home. Now, it is true that there are a lot of people who drive cars in cities that don't have garages. We mentioned this before. I don't have a garage, for example, myself, but that's likely to be taken care of by energy companies or public utilities, putting out charging stations on the street, going through the zoning code like Milwaukee to try to figure out how that's actually going to happen. But also, another thing to think about with this charging station consideration and charging in general for electric vehicles, what if those public utilities and transit agencies that provided power also provided transportation access through passes? So if utility companies operate like they have in the past, they'd want to reduce demand like we did through energy efficient light bulbs, for example. And they wanted to reduce demand at certain times of the day when people are using the most energy. So to reduce demand, they could also offer transit passes or even TDM solutions because they'll not just be trying to reduce traffic and travel demand, but energy demand as well. So I think that's a really important point from this, is thinking about the energy demand that comes from charging electric vehicles and what that means for the grid, and how energy companies, or power companies for that matter, will be thinking about how to manage that demand throughout the day. And if everybody plugs in their cars at night, will that mean that there's even more energy demand at night than during the daytime? Can you use your car as a battery, as some people have suggested? Those are all types of questions that are going to come up when we think about this stuff. I'm sure there's plenty of people that have thought more about this than I have. But I do think it's interesting that we can think of the energy companies and then maybe the transit agencies, and maybe both of them as a public utility generally, and think of how we can reduce not just energy demand, but travel demand by thinking about giving passes to people. It might be something as crazy as, say, giving people who pay the energy bills, like if I'm paying my PG&E bill, I can get, if I paid my bill, then I get a free transit pass for a month or something like that. Or if you move into a place and you get signed up with PG&E, you get, a way to, and you have an electric car, you get in a way to reduce that by giving a transit pass or something along those lines. Or maybe it's like even bike share or scooter share or something along those lines. I don't know. We have to think about this, more intensely, obviously, but I think there's a lot of opportunities there to think about the different ways we can actually move people around without, say, having them continuing to get into a 2-ton electric vehicle, especially in cities. And if you don't have a garage and you don't have a charger, well, then there's still going to be needing to get around and those types of things. So always interesting to think about. So there's a lot of ways you could think about car charging there's a lot of ways you could think about electric car charging effects and transportation writ large, including curb management, travel demand, those types of things. And I'm curious if any of you all have any futurist mindsets and have thought of some of these things, some of these crazy ideas that might change the way we think of transportation, think about driving, think about getting ourselves around cities. Because ultimately, if Aaron is correct and we don't fuel cars the same way we did with gas-powered cars, maybe we don't even use them the same way. maybe we do have an opportunity to change the way we think about this. So I'm always trying to think about this in different ways. I'm always trying to look at the things, kind of turn it around on its head. I've always been interested in seeing how power companies and transit agencies could combine forces because of the coming connection between electric buses, electric vehicles overall, and the transportation that they provide, but also the energy that they need. It's much more. I think it's going to be much more closely connected than, say, the oil and gas companies with automobiles. I mean, they're probably lobbying together in the halls of Congress, but this is going to be a whole different animal, I think. And so it's interesting to think about all those things together. So the zoning codes, how that's going to allow chargers to exist, including, even you can probably even include in a zoning code whether you're supposed to, give out all active transportation and where active transportation is supposed to go. The amount of chargers we actually need, rather than providing all the chargers, maybe it's providing many of the chargers along highway routes and rural routes, but in cities and in garages around the country, maybe there's another way to provide them. That's not that's a different way to go. That because of the way we're gonna fuel our vehicles in the future, whether that's our personal scooter or our personal vehicle. And then finally, just thinking about the way gas stations are used, even gas stations now, as you heard from the discussion we had about the margins that they do, what's going to happen to them? Are there going to be filling stations that are gas stations, or it's just going to be public infrastructure that's all over the city? And so the gas station will just become a convenience store, as it is in a lot of places, and maybe some of them will disappear. It's interesting to go through some of these cities in California that had gas stations and kind of what they've been turned into, whether it's a restaurant or something along those lines. Filling stations used to be so ubiquitous. And so thinking about what happens there is another interesting land use idea as well. Okay, that's all we got for this week. This week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've got people signing up each month during the pandemic. I just had a sign up the other day that I need to send out. I also had somebody buy a scarf the other day, which is really cool. A number of scarves the last couple of weeks because they've been popping off the shelves. I think a winter coming is an indicator that people need to get the bus-only scarf. So $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you your bus-only scarf. And if you want one of our bus-only scarves and you don't want to become a Patreon member, I suggest Patreon because that sustains us continuously. But if you want to support us one time and you love the scarf, you can do so by going to theoverheadwire.com and getting one of those bus-only scarves. Also, I do want to mention, as I always do, that we produced an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning and Practice. And if you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. This book was super fun to produce. And if you're a History of Planning fan, it's the first one listed on the American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books of Planning. There's a lot of really great stuff about segregation, about density, about urbanism. I highly recommend it. Even though it was written in 1909, there's a lot of stuff we can learn from the past. Okay. So if you have a question or comment, feel free to tweet at us or comment on any of the social sites where the podcast appears, or feel free to email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. Okay, finally, puppies and butterflies. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in other sections. So I just wanted to mention, as we mentioned with Tracy last time, that fall is here. It actually rained outside here in San Francisco tonight, which is amazing. I mean, it's rained sprinkled, maybe in the last week. It sprinkled a little bit last week, like a tiny bit. Like you could see it on the windows in the morning a couple weeks ago. But it actually did rain, like it got on the street recently, which was really cool. Just because we were in a drought, obviously, here in the Western United States, and any rain we'll take. I'll take the rain. Bring it. And the other thing about the fall, not just the rain, I like the rain, but the other thing about the fall is that we're getting around to decorating the house for fall, which means pumpkins and scarecrows and other fun stuff. So we put some orange lights out on the bush in front of the house, and one of my favorite things is Halloween. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. As I mentioned last time on the show, I know Tracy has a hankering for candy corns and the fall mix, which has those pumpkins that I like so much. But lights aren't just for Christmas, I should say. They're definitely for Halloween because we're going to do those orange ones preferably. So, all right. Well, you can find me on Twitter at @TheOverheadWire or at TheOverheadWire.com. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. And we'll see you, hopefully with some crazy news of infrastructure bills passing or not passing, whichever way it goes, it's going to be crazy. We'll see you next time.
Talk